Matthew chapter 20. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last."
Good morning. Today I'd like to invite you back, in my memory, to the 1930s. Yeah, that's right. Of course I didn't live in the 1930s, but my folks, my father, told so many stories, I often think I did live in those times. Now, some of you that know me well know that I was a farmer in my first life. Julie and I farmed the family farm and then left to go on to seminary. And in that time, I loved the gift of the farm, and so folks asked me from time to time, "Pastor, do you miss the farm?" I say, well, I don't miss the hard work, and I don't miss the dirt and the dust and all the things you had to breathe in, but I do miss one particular time of the year. I do miss the time of the harvest. Getting out the combine, getting it ready, and then heading out to the field and watching that grain, that beautiful corn come into the hopper. It was always a great time of the year. And so often this time of the year, as we're moving into fall harvest, I can't help but think about how they harvested back then in the 1930s. My dad grew up on the farm too, of course, and lived there and worked as a young man for his father. My dad loved to talk about picking corn by hand. A lot happened in those 1930s. They also would tell me stories about not just my grandpa, but my grandma and picking corn and how she liked to lay out big spreads of food. And as she did that, they also would bring up that from time to time, more often than you might expect, men showed up at the front door. They called them hobos back then during the 1930s. There was a railroad track just a few miles from my dad's farm there, where he grew up with his brothers and sisters. And they'd get off the train there, they'd jump off the boxcars, and they'd start looking for a meal. See, now, the truth is that hobos would mark your place. And no one ever knew what it was, but that's what the folks who were farmers would say. They've got it marked, and so they know whether to go there, whether there's a generous soul living in there, and that was my Grandma Tillie. My Grandma Tillie was generous. She couldn't stand to see a grown man go without supper. So when they showed it up at her back door, and the farmhouse that still sits there today that my cousin lives in, when they would show up to that back door, they would ask for a handout, and she'd say, "Just a minute." And if it was cold, she'd invite him into the back steps and say, "Sit down there, young man, and here, he'd have the same supper that would be served to the family. Or maybe a sandwich and something to go to help him along his way." My grandma was generous like that. And some back then, and probably even more today, would say, isn't that kind of risky business, being that generous, letting those men in your house on the back steps and giving away the food that you hardly had enough of for yourself back in 1937? Well, the answer was yes. Of course it was risky. And they were short on food, but Grandma Tillie made her generosity reach. So it's this time of the year that I often hear of the story of the early storm of 1937. The crop was still, at least part of the crop was still out in the field, and my father and my grandpa had been picking corn by hand along with his brother Art. They worked out there. They picked corn. Back then they said you knew you were a man when you could do a day's work and pick 100 bushels of corn. Now they do that in minutes with these big machines. 100 bushels of corn up into the bin and to the corn crib, and there it would set until you shelled it out in the spring. Well, in 1937, unlike 36, they had a nice crop. 36 was the driest it could be. The winter was terrific, terrible that winter. My dad often said they took the kids to school by going right over top of the fence posts because they did disappear in the snowdrifts. And it was cold and it was tough. But then, as it stopped snowing, it didn't start raining that spring. Some would say in the area where we lived, it didn't rain until the 4th of July, and they harvested grass like this to feed to the horses and the cattle. Just something to chew on, mostly. Anyway, when they got into the harvest of 37, there was a nice crop, a better crop, and so they were eager to get it in, and they worked in the fall like they normally would. A good man, 100 bushels of ear corn a day, and then it got late. It got close to Thanksgiving. And that's what happens. And those storms that come in on Thanksgiving weekend and around that, they seem to be the worst of the whole year. Maybe it's because we're so used to warm weather and short sleeve shirts like this, and then it hits. And that year it did. And the weather was told from one farmer to the next. And the newspapers encouraged them. The radio had broadcasts about a great storm coming in. You better be done because it was going to be over with, and that crop would stand until spring. So as my dad tells it, that morning they got up extra early, long before dark, and they got all the work done, and they hitched up the horses, Roy and Boy, and they hooked them up and sent them out with the wagon. Now, my dad often told about picking ear corn. It was a dangerous business if you were not careful, because if you were standing in the wrong place next to the wrong man, on the other side of the wagon even, that man would throw that ear of corn and miss the wagon and hit you alongside the head. Be careful when you pick corn by hand, my dad would always say. And me, I've never done that. But that day they got the chores done early, long before it was daylight. They did it all in the dark, and as soon as the first light came cracking over that fall morning and bringing sunlight, they were picking corn by hand because they knew that if the weatherman was right, they were not going to get that harvest done. So they started. And sure enough, around 7:30, 8 o'clock, as sunrise was coming up, and they'd been picking ready for a while, the three of them, a hobo showed up. They could see from the field that a hobo came in the yard, and they knew that my Grandma Tillie would feed him. And so my Grandpa August, who was maybe not quite as generous a man, but yet saw an opportunity, went towards the yard and yelled to the hobo, "Hey, fella! How would you like to earn a day's work, like a real day's work and a day's paid, and then have a big feed at the end of the day?" "Well, I'd like that, sir." "Okay, come on out. We're picking corn by hand. You ever done that?" "Well, yes, sir, I have." So about 7:30, 8 o'clock that morning, they had another man. And the prospects got just a little bit better. And so they worked. There was a camaraderie in working and picking corn by hand. Every time a wagon was full, and they'd change out the team and put on a new empty wagon, and someone else would take it in and lift it up with a manual hydraulics and put it in the corn crib, and it was a system, and there was a lot to do. In the meantime, the women folk were all back home cooking, getting ready a big feed, complete with 2 or 3 different kinds of meats and lots of vegetables and pie, and that was just for the noon meal. Then something else happened. Around about 10:30, 11 o'clock, as my father remembers it, 2 hobos showed up in the front yard. Now, whether the word got around and somebody noticed, I don't know. But again, my Grandma Tillie was getting ready to make a big feed. And so my Grandpa August got a little closer to the yard and yelled again, "Hey, you two, how would you like to work in the fields today and make a full day's wage?" That was $1 a day in 1937. $1 a day for a worker. Imagine. And so they went out and they started picking corn. And so now they had doubled their workforce. And when there's corn picking going on, there's a lot of time to talk, and they learned about these hobos and the difficult things that had happened to them during the Great Depression and how they sent anything they got back to their families back home, but it wasn't much. So they were glad for a day's work. $1 could buy a lot in 1937. And they got to know each other. By first name, actually. And they picked corn, load after load, and they were doing better than Grandpa could have ever imagined. So then they went in for dinner. That's what we called noon back on the farm. It was dinner. And then they ate their fill. They had ham and they had beef. Grandma cooked up a couple chickens and 2 or 3 different kinds of vegetables out of the fruit room. And they had pie. They had cherry pie and they had pumpkin pie. And they ate their full till they wondered whether they could even pick corn again. But they went back out. They went back out. And so then it got around to be about 1 o'clock, 1:30. And Grandpa wondered until the day he died how that news got out. But then 3 more men came. 3 hobos came off that train a couple miles over, and they were coming across the yard, and almost as if they were waiting to hear a man yell to them, "Hey, you 3. Grandpa August said, "Why don't you come join me? I got a day's wages for you. We pay $1 a day for a full day's work. Would you want to work part of this day and come join us?" "Yeah," they said. "Yes, sir, we would. We would." And so now they went from 3 men in the morning, my dad Alvin and my brother Art and my grandpa August, and now they had 9 men. The odds were getting better. By 1 o'clock, the snow had started, and it was getting pretty heavy. And they went from T-shirts early in the midday to their heavy coats and their caps and their gloves, and they were trying to pick corn in the midst of a wet snow and watching it come down, all 9 of them, and they were working hard. And Grandpa, having been a farmer for those decades, he knew he wasn't quite going to make it. Some of that corn was going to stand out there in the field. And they were working hard, and Grandpa kept pushing them on and maybe got a little crabby even, so they got the work done, but he knew it wouldn't get finished. And then it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and something unusual happened. This time, 4 hobos showed up in the front yard. 4 of them showed up, and they too seemed to know what was going on, but yet they didn't, it seemed, and Grandma Tillie greeted them, waiting for my Grandpa August to speak forth. He came in from the field and walked on over and said, "Hey, fellas, we need your help. I'll promise you a fair wage, and I'll promise you a feast tonight that my wife Tillie is going to cook, and the girls in the kitchen have already got prepared all the food you can eat. Would you help us?" "Yes, sir, we would." "Do you know how to pick corn?" "Yes, sir, we do." And they went. And they started picking corn. And they picked corn. It got later, it got closer to dark and closer to dark. Kind of hard to pick corn in the dark. Horses don't have lights on their rear ends. But Grandpa began to believe that they'd gone from 3 men at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then up to 6, and then to 9, and now to over 13. They had a lot of folks, and it got closer and closer, and the snow got heavier and heavier. By that time, they were covered in white, and the ground was full to the point that horses were starting to feel a little bit as they pulled those wagons. And before dark came, those 13 men, my Uncle Art, my dad Alvin, and my Grandpa August, and those hobos finished the crop. And you should have seen my grandpa. He was filled with joy. He was so excited that corn crop was going to be in the corn bins and not out in the field all winter. He was so happy that he brought everybody back, and they cleaned them off and wiped them down, and they got the chores done, and they all went down in the basement and set up some big tables, and they had supper. And a supper that most of those men hadn't had for months, if ever. all that food. More added from noon. Meats and vegetables and potatoes and salads and of course, pie. And Grandma had even got out the ice cream maker and had my Aunt Louise bring up some homemade ice cream. And it was a feast beyond imagination. And everybody was full and everybody was satisfied. And there was a whole new table of friends having made the harvest. They were so excited. And then it came time to pay. So Grandpa paid the last first. And everyone was watching and amazed to see that Grandpa pulled out a crisp new dollar bill and gave it to those last 4 men that came so late in the day. And then he asked the next ones up that had stopped and said, here's your pay. And he gave them the same crisp dollar bill. And by that time, the fellows that had shown up early in the morning, like 7:30, 8 o'clock, they got anticipation. They started doing the math in their head, thinking they were going to have $2 to send home to their families, and it would be great. But when they got to my grandpa, he gave him a crisp dollar bill. And it's then that they have the nerve to speak up. Now, wait a minute, August. I hate to be too pushy here, but you know, we worked more than twice some of these men here that you gave a crisp dollar bill to, a full day's wage, and we reckon we might be worth more. No, boys, $1 a day. And they protested. And they were angry. And they started making a little ruckus and a little trouble. And so my Uncle Art stood up, and my dad Alvin stood up, and August stood up, and the boys realized maybe that wasn't worth it. And then my grandpa said, you know, you fellas, I know times are hard, but are you envious because those fellas got the same thing? I learned generosity from my dear wife Tillie. And that just spreads. And are you mad at us because we're generous with everyone in the way we are with what we've got? Don't get me wrong. Thank you, boys, for all that you did. And it's recognized and it's appreciated. But are you envious? Are you jealous? Grandpa August said, don't be, boys. Don't be filled with envy. But instead, even during this dark depression, watch for the generosity. And then, you'll be blessed. That's the story from the harvest of 1937.